Hi everyone, my name is Damien. I'm working as a senior technical support engineer. I've been working at Qlik since 2013, and my main focus is QlikSense APIs and authentication. So today's agenda is leveraging API in QlikSense SaaS. So we're gonna first talk about why use API, then what API you can use, how to use them, and what to do when things go wrong.
Okay, Damien, I've heard a lot about APIs, but what exactly can APIs do for you? Why would you use them?
So you would use API to automate some different tasks or call them from an external program. So you can perform some administrative tasks. So basically everything that you can do in the console in QlikSense Cloud. You can do some front-end action, such as applying a selection, applying a bookmark.
Is it free to use APIs or is there some sort of special licensing that's required?
So you don't need a special license to use API, but based on the action that you're gonna do, for example, if you want to do an action inside an app, modifying an app, then you would need to have a professional license assigned to the user because only professional users are allowed to modify an app. You can call directly the Qlik associative engine with your own data, and you can embed a QlikSense object on your own website.
So it's kind of just a different interface with the program. Can we see some of these APIs in action?
Of course. So we first go to qlik.dev and use one of the examples that is available.
I guess click.dev would be where someone would go to get started using APIs.
That's right, for QlikSense SaaS, that's the best place to get started with APIs.
All right.
We're going to first look into Qlik CLI. What we're going to show now is how to create an app, add the reload script, and then reload the app.
So just a few commands will create an app, add the load script, and reload it on your QlikSense SaaS tenant.
That's correct. So first of all, we're going to run this command. I'm going to show my QlikSense hub and verify that I only have one app consumer cell in my tenant.
Okay.
And now I'm going to run the command to create the app.
So this is just a regular Windows command prompt.
Yes, that's just a regular Windows command prompt. And Qlik CLI have been installed prior to this. We are now getting the app ID of the app that just got created. We can go back to the hub and check the app.
That was quick.
So we can open the app and check its content. Go to the script editor. We can see that for now we only have the default line in the script editor.
Okay.
We're now gonna run the command to add the script to the app that you can also find on this same page. We need to put the app in a Qlik script file.
Okay, so you already have a separate file that has the script that you're going to insert into this app.
That's correct. I've created already a file that I've placed in ctemp. Here we can see the content of this file. So that's just the auto-generated script that lets you create some dummy data. And you can insert this in a QlikSense script just by pressing Ctrl+0+0 from the script editor usually.
That's a great tip. People may not be aware that if you just go into script editor and QlikSense and type in Control+0+0, it'll auto-generate this script, which will create dummy data for testing apps. That's a great tip, Damien.
So now we're gonna go to the command prompt again, and we are gonna type this line, and I need to copy this app ID. The app has been saved. We can go back to the data load editor and refresh the page.
And there's your script.
Then the next step would be to reload this app through a command, which is also available on this same page on qlik.dev. Now the command that we're gonna type is this one, same app ID. Now I'm gonna go back to the hub. I can go to details. If I go to the reload history, I can see that the app was reloaded successfully and it took 5 seconds to reload it.
That's pretty cool. So 3 lines of code and you have an app with script and it's reloaded. What are other kind of APIs that you can do or what sort of actions can you perform with APIs besides the three that you just showed us?
Basically, anything that can be performed in the console can also be performed with the REST API, which are for administrative tasks. We have the JavaScript API, which is for any kind of front-end action, which would be apply a selection, apply a bookmark, create alternate state, or those kind of things. And JSON RPC API, where you interact directly with the Click engine through WebSocket, can be used to do any kind of action that is done inside an app. Then we have the libraries. The libraries are used to facilitate the use of the APIs. Enigma.js is to communicate with the Click engine API through JavaScript instead of having to deal directly with JSON RPC. Enigma Go is the same thing for Go. And then you have Nebula.js that is used to facilitate the creation of extension and mashups.
And the demo you showed us before, that was with ClickCLI?
That's correct. So the demo we did just before was done with the tool that is called ClickCLI.
Okay, where can we find out more information about these APIs?
You can find more information about APIs on click.dev here, which are getting you started, the different things that you need to know before you use the APIs. Then the different types of APIs are available here. You can see everything that is actually a public API currently, and the JavaScript API, JSON RPC API, everything is in here. So you might notice that some of them are marked as experimental.
Yeah, I was wondering what that meant.
You can find what it means in the API governance section. There is no deprecation period for experimental. Stable, you have a 6-month deprecation period, and locked have a 12-month deprecation period. So it's even more important in SaaS because you don't have control on the version that is run on the server as it's constantly updated.
So which APIs would you recommend using in a production environment?
So in a production environment, it's recommended to use a stable or locked API.
What other sort of setups are required before you can actually start using APIs?
In order to use the API, you must take into consideration how you authenticate to the API and also do some initial setup. For the authentication part, you can either authenticate with an API key or through interactive authentication, which is done through the Click ID or with your own IDP, your identity provider.
Okay, so one or the other. There are some situations where you might need both.
Mainly API keys you would use for programs that run server-side, while the interactive authentication you would use for programs that use on the client side. So for example, when embedded an object in a browser, then you would have to go with the interactive authentication.
Okay.
And it's also good to note that anonymous users are not supported in ClickSense SaaS, so you will have to authenticate if you want to use the APIs or embed a ClickSense object in your website.
Well, that makes sense. It's highly secure, so ClickSense SaaS needs to know who is submitting commands to it.
Then regarding the initial setup, we have the Web Integration ID and Content Security Policy, which are used to secure the ways that ClickSense objects are integrated in a website.
Do you think you could show us an example of actually embedding in a website?
So I'm gonna show how to embed ClickSense in an iframe.
I see we're back on your tenant management console.
The first thing that we need to do would be to set up the web integration and the content security policy. In this case, I will be running my iframe on my IIS server, which is installed on my server here, which is called clickserver2.domain.local.
Okay, and that's just a machine where we've already set up a web server using IIS.
Yes, that's correct. Here I'm getting my web integration ID that I will use later in my sample, and I will create also the content security policy. In this case, I'm also using the clickserver2.domain.local, and I will select frame ancestor.
What is frame ancestors specifically, or why did you add that?
Frame ancestor means the parent website in here in the origin, I've put my parent website, and I will be allowed to embed in an iframe only from this website.
Okay.
Now I'm gonna use a sample that is available in our knowledge base that can easily be found from our support knowledge base or just on Google, like just typing Qlik Cloud Services iframe. What I'm gonna do is just copy all this.
So this is basically a script that will allow you to embed a Qlik object into an iframe.
That's right. What I'm gonna do now is just create a new file, paste the script, save it. I'm gonna move it to the IS folder later on. The only reason why I'm not doing it directly is that I don't have rights to save directly in the IS folder. Now I've saved my file, and you see that I have the coloring, making this much more easier to read. The next thing I'm gonna do is replace your tenant by my actual tenant name.
It's a pretty handy way of updating things like that.
Yes, Control F to show this windows, and then just this button which is replace all. We are gonna now copy the web integration ID that was just created and paste it here. Then the next thing that we are gonna need to update is this link with the iframe here. We're gonna use demo app for this purpose. Consumer sales, it's not imported by default in Qlik Sense cloud environment, but it can be downloaded from demos.qlik.com. We need to go and fetch an actual object that exists. For example, there's a map object here. Just right click, choose share, and then choose embed. Then you have the iframe link here to this object. You can just click on copy, and we're gonna replace this whole block here with the iframe code that we've just copied. Then we can just save this file, and I'm gonna place now this file in my IS root folder in here. And now I'm gonna run Chrome as another user just to show the whole flow of how this sample will redirect you to your identity provider if you're not logged in yet. Add a new person here in Chrome. I prefer to do that instead of running as an incognito session, because incognito session have some specific security settings that would make it look different from a natural session.
And this could be an alternative to running the application as a different user, because you're just creating a new user to run the application. Great tip.
That's correct. I'm now gonna type name of my IS server.
All right, so now you're visiting that page you created.
Yes, and I'm getting redirected now to my identity provider, which is Auth0 in this case. Now we can see the iframe loading, and we can also interact with this chart by just clicking player selection.
And this is your iframe page, just kind of blank at the top, blank at the bottom, but it has the object embedded in the center.
That's correct, yes.
Very cool. So what do you do when things don't go perfectly as expected? How would you go about troubleshooting something going wrong?
When things go wrong, we have different way of troubleshooting based on which API we want to troubleshoot. PowerShell or curl if you're on Mac or Linux to troubleshoot REST APIs. Then browser developer tools, mostly used to troubleshoot web applications and to check how things can be done from the hub, for example. And we have Fiddler, which is a network trace tool.
Okay, what are we looking at?
So here we have a script that is creating a new API keys.
Okay.
In this case, I'm creating an API key which would be named test4 and has a validity of 1 day. As administrator, you also have a bit more control on the API key. For example, you can enable them. That's the first step when you create an API key. There's a tutorial for that on Qlik Dev. Also, if you go in tutorial and go to generate your first API key, you have the whole procedure on how to enable them. Basically, you would need to enable them here. Then you set a maximum token expiration in days. And then you can also set a number of active API keys per user so that you make sure that users don't create tons of API keys, which would lower the security of the system. Doing this from the API is actually very handy because when an API key expired, you would need to renew it. So that's my current API key that is valid, and I'm using this one to request a new one. So when you renew an API key, you would need to apply the same logic in your own code before the expiration date, run this kind of command and get a new API key and then update it from your code, which would make it much more easier because you only need to get the API key from the UI the first time you get one.
So Damien, when working with API keys, what do you recommend?
I like to use PowerShell to troubleshoot that because you can see exactly what body you are passing, which header you are passing, and you can, in this case, narrow down if there's a logic problem in your own code or if you're just passing the wrong arguments.
And where did you get the code that we're looking at?
This little sample was the reference of this API on ClickDev. If you would go to APIs and go to API keys, then you have create an API key resource with the documentation on how to do it. But if you're not very sure on how that should be done, a good tip to remember is to go directly through the hub or through the console. In this case, we go to the hub because the API keys are created from the hubs in settings, and you go to API keys and you would open the browser developer tools.
And how did you open the browser developer tools?
So that's done by pressing F12. You can also find them in the menu here, developer tools, and going to the network tab here. Then you would just do the action that you are trying to accomplish with the API. Put a name here, click on generate. So here this succeeded, and you can just click here and see the API that was sent, which is that I currently have here. And if I just paste, you would see that nothing has changed. If you go a bit more down here and look at the body, you would see, for example, expiry.
That's great seeing the demonstration that the APIs are really just performing the same actions as the console, and that you can find the exact code to use via the developer tools. Great tip. Damien, so far everything's been going right. What could go wrong here?
What could go wrong is that you have, for example, a wrong format in the expiry, and that would, or in this case, it's because I've reached the maximum number of API key that you're getting this error for that. So I would need to actually delete the API key. I'm just gonna do it from the UI for this time. I'm gonna delete this test4 and go back to PowerShell and try to create a new one, but with a wrong format, and that would give you this kind of error 400. The next example that is embedding into a mashup, and also how to troubleshoot when it comes to a mashup. For this example, I'm gonna use this sample that can also be found from the support knowledge base, and gonna copy this code. I would need to create 2 files this time.
What tool do you use to create those mashup files?
I'm gonna go in Visual Studio Code, create a new file, paste the code here, save as. I'm gonna call it helpdesk.html. I'm also gonna replace your tenant by my actual tenant name.
Is there anything else that needs to be updated in this file?
Not in this file. The second file that we gonna create is a JavaScript file. Just gonna copy this whole code, create a new file, paste it here. I'm just gonna save it as helpdesk.js. So save. If you call it something else, you would also need to update it here.
And what is this mashup that you're creating supposed to do?
This mashup will just show one object in a div element, and can add a few more action and see how to troubleshoot when it goes wrong. First of all, I'm gonna replace your tenant by my tenant name. Then I'm gonna update the web integration ID.
And again, that's the ID that allows your private web server to interact with your ClickSense SaaS environment.
Yes, now we're gonna actually need to update the app ID and also the object ID, the object that we want to show. Just gonna go back to the hub again and pick up my favorite app, Consumer Sales. So this time we can pick up this colorful chart, go in Share and Embed. But this time we will just need to copy this object ID here and place it here. And then update the app ID. The easiest way is just to copy it from the URL here. Then just save the file. And now we are gonna copy those two files that we just created to our IIS web server. So I'm just gonna reuse that same session and just go to helpdesk.html.
That was a great demo of when everything is working. Would you be able to show us an example where things aren't behaving as expected so we can see how to troubleshoot that?
This example is actually exactly the same one, but I've added those two lines. One line which is to show the current selections in an object, and another line which is done to apply a bookmark.
Okay, and that bookmark is called product group.
That's correct. And I've also moved around the object and resized so that it looks a little bit nicer. Now we're gonna see this example in our browser with the browser developer tools open so that I can see what is happening. I'm in the network tab and I have filtered on WebSocket. In my bookmark, I have two selections applied, but this bookmark seemed to not have been applied. I'm now gonna check in the WebSocket messages why that bookmark didn't get applied. I'm gonna search for apply, which would tell me that is actually the command that I run, apply bookmark. So it was actually sent, the request was sent. I can confirm that from here. And now I'm gonna check the response of this request for that need to search for the ID number 4.
So hopefully the response from ClickSense will tell us what happened.
That's correct. And here we can see queue success, that was false, and means that applying this bookmark did not succeed. We can see here that the parameter that was passed was product group. So let's go and check the documentation for apply bookmark and see if we did things correctly. We were using app.bookmark.apply, which is part of the capability API. I'm now gonna go to the help site. The capability API is actually almost the same in ClickSense for Windows and ClickSense for SaaS. I'm on help.click.com. You also have the same documentation on click.dev. You have to pass a bookmark ID. So the bookmark ID here, which should look in this example like this. But what we've passed is the bookmark name, which is incorrect.
Okay, so in our code, we entered the name of the bookmark instead of the actual string, which is the bookmark ID.
That's correct. So the bookmark ID would ever be in this format or this format.
It would have been so much nicer if it turned an error message instead of just not working. But this is a great troubleshooting tip so you can see why that actually happened and the reasons behind it.
We're gonna find this bookmark ID in order to apply it. There's not really an easy way to find this bookmark ID from the UI, unfortunately. We are gonna apply this bookmark from the UI and check from the developer tools its ID. In the same way that we were troubleshooting our mashup, we would open the browser developer tools with F12 or through the Chrome or Tools browser developer tools in the network tab and refresh the page. Then filter on WS WebSocket and take this WebSocket here. Now we're gonna apply this bookmark. So search for apply, and we are finding here this method with apply bookmark. And in the parameter here, we see the actual bookmark ID. So we can copy the bookmark ID from here and just put it in our code here. Just save, copy again to my IIS server, just to be sure that my mashup works now. remove the bookmark first and close all of this. And now I'm going to go back to my mashup and refresh the page. And I see here that I now have my bookmark got applied with the toSelection. The last tool that we had was Fiddler, which I can briefly talk about.
And when would you use Fiddler?
Fiddler can be used to trace the network. It's a little bit similar to what you see actually in the Browser Developer Tool Network tab, but you would use it where you are troubleshooting an API that is not run from browser. So for example, if you run something on your server, an application on your server that is sending requests to Qlik Cloud, then you would use Fiddler to troubleshoot if the request is going through.
What kind of application might that be, just as an example?
For example, if you want an automation tool on your server, a Node.js application that is triggering task, then triggering another task upon completion, all those kind of things. And as it doesn't run in a browser, you won't be able to use the network tab, but you would be able to use Fiddler, just install Fiddler on the machine from where that application is running. And you would be able to see the same kind of things that you see in the network tab in the Browser Developer Tool.
So what are some other resources people can use to help troubleshoot?
When things go wrong, you can use some of those additional resources, collaboration and assistance on Qlik community, on the Qlik branch Slack channel. There's documentation on qlik.dev and help.qlik.com. And finally, if you find a defect, you can report it to Qlik support.
Okay, everyone, now it's time for Q&A. Please submit your questions through the Q&A panel on the left side of your On24 console. Damien, which question would you like to address first?
The first question is how to set up Qlik Sense object in a mashup to automatically refresh. It's not very clear to me if refresh meant to refresh the page or refresh the data. So refresh the page, you would need to do it from the mashup code to refresh. So just reload the page so that it shows the most recent state. If refresh refers to refresh data, then you would need to trigger the reload through either through the JavaScript API or through the REST API. More documentation can of course be found on qlik.dev on how to do that. For the REST APIs, you would need to do it from the reloads here, create a reload an app specified by an app ID. And if you want to do it through the JavaScript APIs, then there's also in the capability API.
I have a question for you, Damien. An example like this, like reloading, where there are several different APIs that can perform the same function. How do you decide which one to use?
Like for reloading, the way that you would decide which one to use would be either if you want to do it as an administrator or as an app developer. Basically, the one from the capability API would be the same thing than pressing the reload button in the data load editor, and that can only be performed by a user that is a professional user, and that would also lock the app while the reload is being performed. While if you do it through a task, that won't lock the app when the reload is performed, and it will just refresh once it's finished. If you're using the app in a custom interface and are doing modification on the app and you want to reload from that interface, then you would want to use the capability API to reload it. While if you just want it to reload transparently to the user, then you would use the REST API to reload it as a task.
Okay. Next question.
The next question is, will this same API calls work with Qlik View server? The Qlik View server has very different structure and APIs than the Qlik Sense. Some of the API calls that we can find here on QlikDev actually command to Qlik Sense on-premise and Qlik Sense SaaS, but they are completely different on the one from Qlik View server. So the answer would be no, you cannot use it with Qlik View server. The next question is, can you enable a reload button for a user to manually trigger a reload from an app using an extension? That's actually possible. You can program an extension that would call either a task to reload the app, or just reload the app through the capability API, like you would press the reload button from the data load editor. However, this requires different set of rights. If you reload from the capability API, the user that clicks that button will need to have operational license assigned and also have rights to modify that app. While if you do it on as a task, then the user will need to have sufficient administrative privileges to run the task. The next question is, can you integrate the same API with ClickSense SaaS and ClickSense on Windows? As I said a bit earlier, some of those API, like the capability APIs, are common to ClickSense on Windows and ClickSense SaaS. More than 90% of the capability APIs are actually the same in ClickSense SaaS and ClickSense on Windows, as well as ClickSense Engine API. JSON RPC is actually the same also. There are a few exceptions that do not work in SaaS or do not work in Windows, but they are mostly the same. And then when it comes to the REST API, they are completely different than the one in Windows, because those are different services that are running in the background when it comes to everything that is administrative. The next question is, what is the recommended API to call to trigger reload task? When it comes to trigger reload tasks, the best way is to do it with the REST API, with the reload API that we've shown earlier here. So that's the easiest way to trigger a task, and the most common one also. Okay. The next question is, does accessing a mashup require a license for the user? Any user that would access a mashup would need a license. If the user is only visualizing the objects, then he will only need an analyzer license. If the user is actually doing some change to the app through the mashup, then he would need a professional license.
That makes sense. Okay, Damien, we have time for one last question.
The last question is it possible to export an app as a QVF file with the API? You can export an app with the REST API. You would go, in this case, to apps, and you can search for export here, export a specific app, and you have the documentation on how to export it here. So we're done with this session for today. Thank you everybody for attending.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. We hope you enjoyed this session. Thanks to Damien for presenting. We appreciate getting experts like Damien to share with us. Here's our legal disclaimer. And thank you once again. Have a great rest of your day.